Hey guys, welcome back. We are on commute. Grab your coffee, get up a seat. Make sure you put your seatbelt on. We're already on the move. And so I'm asking you guys to just continue to be in prayer for us as we go forward in the name of the Lord. This week we started a series just on holiness, and holiness is so important to our person and Christian lifestyle that I can't emphasize it enough. We started dealing with holiness is not about perfection or an ideal concepts of righteousness. That's kind of secondary to the images of holiness. Holiness has a lot more to do with just understanding what God is and what he does for us and being connection to us. And the biggest deal is just setting us apart. Today, I want to talk some about just some of the hazards of holiness. And they do come with some hazards that keep us from being holy or accepting the holiness that God has provided for us, to us, and one of the hazards of holiness that we saw in the life of Peter is during the time where Peter comes with Christ. They've walked him away in the last couple of days to Caiaphas and Annas' house, the high priest. And when they get him there, a couple people identify Jesus' companion. And they say, hey, here's one who's been called out with him. And the first thing Peter says is, no, it's not me. That was with a young girl. Another guy says, hey, he was one of those who were walking with Jesus. He was holy and called out. And Peter says, no, that was not me. One guy says, he's got to be him. He's a Galilean. How can he not be with him? And Peter denies him 3 times. Jesus looks over and they remember a previous conversation where he says, you'll deny me 3 times. And the cock crowed and Peter cried. You guys know the story. But that's what holiness does. And there are some hazards to holiness because it'll set you apart. Or as some people have oftentimes said, you've been picked out to be picked on. And what people will generally do is walk away from it because people will pick on your imperfections. But you have to realize if you were perfect, you wouldn't need Jesus in the first place. And so I want to give you these keys and nuggets today to encourage you. Just because God has set you apart doesn't mean that God has set you up for a failure. The devil will have you believing that just because God has set you apart, some things are going wrong in your life, or you're isolated and you don't have friends or nobody's communing with you. And even at church, it seems like people let you down. And with COVID, it's hard to even get with other people of like-mindedness. But just because God has moved you apart from the crowd, don't try to fit in. And that's one of the things that Peter did that we want to learn from today. The more he tried to fit in, the more he seemed to fall apart. And that's what happens with a lot of us. The more we try to fit in with other people, the more we fall apart. God has set you aside and set you apart for a reason. Stop trying to fit in. It doesn't mean that something is wrong with you just because you're alone with you. Get that. You don't. I wish somebody would get that in your spirit. Just because you're up at 6:30 in the morning and nobody else is around you doesn't mean that something is wrong with you. It possibly could mean that God has set you apart to do something great in you. People don't go to surgery 2 by 2. Generally, they go to surgery 1 by 1. And they lay on a table, and there's a full company of people who are concentrating on your one area that needs to be improved. Life is kind of like that God does for you. He takes you one at a time and transform you one situation, one element at a time. And so we have to be conscientious that just because God has set us apart doesn't mean that God has set you down. God has picked you up and moved you to a side and isolated you to do a special work in you, not to leave you alone, but to do a wonderful divine work in you. And it's really called to make you holy. I have to tell you this because the devil will have you believe that God has put you out here to be not only isolated and lonely, and you'll confuse loneliness with holiness. Many prophets have done it before. Samson was always looking for a companion and found himself with Delilah. Abraham was looking for a finish of a promise and fell for the lies that he felt like Hagar could accomplish what God was already about to do in his life. Moses was looking for agreement and tolerance of other people, and so he turned into a murderer. David is alone on a roof, and he found himself with Bathsheba. Other prophets like Elijah is alone, and he declared, I'm the only one. There are so many people throughout the Bible who are isolated for God's divine purpose, but the devil will have them believe that the reason why God has brought you out here is to destroy you. And I want to tell you this morning, God has not left you alone to destroy you. God has left you alone so that he can work out a divine work in you that nobody else can share. Because what God has given you is for you. And what God gives you, the world can't take away. There is truly a peace that passes understanding that God has to place in your heart. But you have to be willing to accept it and be willing to be a little bit isolated in order for God to insulate you. You have to be willing to be isolated so God can insulate the truth that's within you rather than you walking around with a truth that the world gives you. And so Peter, when he comes out, he's just following at a distance behind Jesus. And we want to be careful following at a distance behind Jesus. When we follow at a distance, what we're trying to say is, Jesus, I want to see you, but I still want to get along with everybody else. That's a dangerous position. The best position is to get up close, because in the presence of the Lord is fullness of joy, and at his right hand is pleasures evermore. That's scripture. So we need to make sure that we stay close to Christ and don't follow at a distance. And lastly, don't try to fit in with somebody just because they seem like they got a cozy fire. The reason why they need a fire on the outside is because they probably didn't have something burning on the inside. They try to do things on the outside and it looks like there's a great time going on the outside. You know what I'm talking about, or maybe it's just me. It looks like drinking is a nice time, but I guarantee you, just because it looks like a party going on the outside, that's because they're missing on something on the inside. You guys understand what I'm saying? It always looks like somebody's having a better time. And on the outside, like Asaph said, why does it seem like people are always doing well? But the reason why it only looks like that on the outside is because they struggle what's going on the inside. The old philosopher would say, still waters run deep. And so it's the quiet moments that seem like people are deep. I want to encourage you today, just because the fire seems like it's warming up in the situation and it seems like everybody's coming into a nice, cozy environment, don't try to get away from what God has called you to do to fit in with the group. Sometimes it's better to be cold than it is to be out of God's will. And so deal with your coolness in the season. Deal with the struggles and sometimes the isolation. But remember, it is not to kill you. It's only to allow you to prosper. God says, I got a plan for you to prosper and not to fail. And I want you to have abundant life. And so we're smashing some beliefs and ideas together because they're true. God has now anointed you and made you holy and set you apart to set you up for the greatest life that he could ever imagine that you would have. So don't let the devil convince you that something is wrong with you because you're isolated by yourself. Remember, your isolation is so God can give you a personal gift prepared just for you. I'll talk to you more tomorrow, but we want to make sure when we grab a hold of holiness, I want you to grab it with both hands and say, God, I embrace being set apart. I may be set apart, but I would much rather be set apart by God than be brought in by a company of people doomed to fail. We'll see you guys tomorrow where we talk more about the love and joy and the hunger for being holy.